So thank you again. It is such my pleasure to welcome Sarah Nahar. I'm going to read and extemporaneously invite her. So Sarah, who is an MDiv, your first opportunity to be impressed. That's true. She is a Master of Divinity. She's from Elkhart, Indiana, on Potawatomi traditional land, and she's a fifth-year PhD student. You didn't know you could get that much school, but you can. And Sarah is doing it for our benefit and her own punishment. She's both at Syracuse University, where her research focus is on the toilet, the ritual and the receptacle, right? So how we think about that and how we actually use it. And I think you're going to hear a lot about that today. But she's matriculating concurrently while she's at Syracuse. She's also at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in the Department of Environmental Studies. If that wasn't enough, she has a beautiful young child and a husband who's very busy and working on lots of things. Is incredibly dedicated to social justice and working on dismantling the doctrine of discovery, community organizing, and she also does capoeira. So in case you were like, can you do it all? You can, not all at the same time. And she is tired, I imagine. And she's also joining us graciously on Zoom and will be here later in person. So please give a giant welcome to Sarah Nahar.
Thank you all so much. Just doing a little sound check here. How does it sound? Oh, fantastic. It's so great. Yeah. Well, wow. This is so amazing to be with you all here on Zoom. I just want to, thank, how real the folks at Rich Earth Institute are and how flexible. I was intending to be there already this morning, but I was so close to finishing one of my dissertations. I just wanted to finish the whole thing. So last night at 11 p.m., I turned the first one in, and the second one I'll get to work on after some break time. But I just to complete that, and I'm going to present from that in a second. And then also, it turns out like our little toddler had a little low-grade fever. So wow, just having to reroute at these times is awesome to be working with and connected with people who understand that and are so gracious. And so, but I am coming as soon as I finish up with the keynote. I'm gonna stay on the Zoom and travel from where I am in Syracuse, New York, Haudenosaunee land, over to you all at the Hill, and I'll be looking forward to that trip. I mean, I have to come. I have 30 gallons of pee I need to bring to the depot. We collect it here in Syracuse, and then we wait for any excuse to get to Brattleboro, and this is definitely a great one. So we'll be on the way. Thank you, Sean, for the intro and for your camaraderie as I've begun to deepen in this work. And it indeed was, Rich Earth Institute was one of the first groups of people that you're like, do you know these folks? Let's get to know them. And I remember when you traveled to the summit to speak, and you traveled with all your pee as well. So I guess that's what keynotes do for Rich Earth. We come bringing the liquid gold. Yes. So it is wonderful to be here today. So I'm going to share my screen from another computer. And so what I would invite you to do both at the summit and if it will allow you to is I don't need to be a small floating head in this. If you adjust your screen, this is also always important to be able to do. So you can see me and you can see the presentation. All right. So hopefully that will work for you to get about half and half of the screen. Everyone might need to do that from their own. All right. So yeah, here we are with a topic that we know both too much and too little about. Like in a way, each of you is an expert and has intimate knowledge of this topic, but there is, in general, a dearth of info about it. But I want to begin with the end in mind. And the heart of what I want to share today is that if we come up with systems that stop treating shit like shit, we may also be able to stop treating people like shit and the broader earth, right? Just the idea that there are connections between how our discard systems function at every level. I want to begin with some acknowledgments. The words that come before all else are very important in Haudenosaunee space, and those are words of gratitude. And so just to like, just keep going from where Sean brought us, for the people, the plants, the animals, the elements, all that we are in relationship with at this time, that goes much deeper than any of the surface tension that we may be experiencing. And interestingly enough, the Onondaga people, whose wampum is here in the middle in purple and white there, they were actually they're incredible diplomats and helped to organize the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, which was a 40-year struggle to get that to come to fruition. They used to be known as those who shit in the woods. And it was like a tease given to them to say, hey, they're traditional or they're backward. But actually now, as Kathleen Meyer points out in her book, How to Shit in the Woods, the reclamation of a lost art, right? It would be great if we figured out how to do this reclamation of both pee, poop, menstrual blood. Just look at our excreta as a gift, our leftover nutrients, and figure out how to do that again. So they have had a great law of peace that has really persevered despite great tragedy. And they, in studying here in their space, has reminded me that like the way that we do things in like settler colonial society is not the only way. And also, I live by an intensely polluted lake from the combination of industrial wastewater and chemicals, sewerage, and field runoff. And so it is my greatest wish today that all we do in this conference enhance, the land back and indigenous sovereignty movement, is a way that we can clean up the spaces where we have studied, where you all live, right? And I just want to acknowledge also some labor realities. New York, where I'm living, was an enslaving state at a massive scale for 200 years, and a state where the energy of abolition, though, pushed back on that. And so in 1827, slavery was abolished. But I just want to recognize that the labor and how we get here today has real implications for how and what we do. So I do want to thank the people that are laboring so that I can be here, and you all as well. And it's not lost on me that the first Africans that arrived in New York were from the Congo. And so I have an image there of two hands on a computer, and even just how I'm connecting with you today, like the Congo very directly is impacted by mass extraction of minerals. And, all of that since, the 1600s has built the wealth of New York. And we know here, gather here, that we have wealth that comes out of our bodies, and the reclamation of that which is produced naturally versus developing unnatural systems of exploitation and labor, that it is enough, and we have enough, and that there's a lot of wealth in that. And I'm going to share with you from my dissertation. And so I wrote a lot of this dissertation during a pandemic, and now I'm writing it in the middle of a genocide in Gaza. And that's particularly pertinent to this work because the sanitation crisis has been created there as a tool of war. And so I'm hoping that this work points to a future beyond extraction, towards regeneration, and towards depth of connection that we need for one another in every place. So in conclusion to these opening words, I want to shout out my family and my fellow travelers and my advisors who I'm pictured here with, Dr. Sharon Moran and Dr. Phil Arnold. And they've helped me to do this research together with others for a world of excretory justice. So I would love for a little interactive piece right now for those who are in the chat. Let's see. All right, the group chat is open, as well as those who are in the summit. Growing up, what did your primary caregivers call the stuff that came out of your butt? I always like to collect these, and it's always interesting to hear what the different languages. And it's great. And I learned that Sean also did this too. So Sean's my mentor in much of this, and he personally has like collection of probably over 100 words, so you can ask him at break. We got Lucy Goosey coming in the chat. We got Poo Poo. We have Pip. which may be Dutch. Not sure. There. We got stinker. We also have they avoided talking about it. Kind of the silence around these aspects. Gruncy, BM, right? But mostly we didn't call it anything. Not spoken about. Number two, caca. Many different words. Um, why do I ask about this? There's a taboo. There's about taboo talking about pee and poop, and here we are to break it, right? Because these euphemisms, there's scientific words, there's phrases, and I recognize too it might have felt a little inappropriate to share. Maybe not this crowd, this is the crowd, it's ready to go. Let's talk about it. But even the difference between peeing and pooping, right? Like we say, I'm gonna go to the bathroom, or some people say I have to pee. Usually, unless you're like among close ones, you don't like specifically say I need to poop, or I'm gonna have a BM. So it's interesting even to think between the two kind of major substances that we're talking about right here, that there's some differences. So that's fascinating. But yeah, for the most part, children are taught not to use bathroom words in public, and English doesn't have a neutral word to describe the nutrients and leftovers that come out of the body. Like poo is considered kind of childish. Feces and excrement seem too scientific for a normal conversation. Colloquially, poop is often used, but stool and bowel movement, they like resound when you're in the doctor's office. And while the word shit offends people, it comes from a family of words, Rose George says, that also contain the Greek word shitzen, the Latin scindere, the Old English skitan. All of this like means sooner or later to like divide, separate. Actually, this is connected to like just as science is the art of dividing or distinguishing things by knowledge. So shit has noble roots. And it's like, even though I wasn't really caught on across the global north, like it's very common to hear here in India. And this is important because if we don't have a neutral word to speak about this, it's very difficult to address the sanitation crisis, or to reclaim these nutrients. So in my work, I had a chance to read books by various people, and so many of them were still alive. And so I would email them and give them and say, can we jump on a phone call? Can we have a conversation? And so this is here David Walter Taves, who wrote the book, The Origin of Feces, what excrement tells us about evolution, ecology, and sustainable society. And he often would say, like, shit storms successfully through all the artificial barricades that we have erected. And Rose George, returning to this, just said, I don't want to have things hidden just because we don't have the appropriate words for them. 1 second. The keys are hanging on the coat rack over there. Right. So please just bear with me. I'm gonna dive in and use a range of language today. Yeah. My work is at the intersection of religion and environmental studies. And also in religion, we look at how there are things called taboo, which are set apart and forbidden, and to recognize that poo could have become taboo because it was set apart, forbidden, or definitely forbidden to eat or mess with anyway. And this taboo is supported by the evolutionary principle of like, don't poop where you eat. Like it must be separated somehow till it decomposes. But besides don't poop where you eat, all the rest is culture. So poop was understood to be used as fertilizer, or it could be fertilizer, or definitely that it was something that certainly plants were going around the area there it was. But temporary taboos would not have meant disposal. Yeah. So how do we get to this, infrastructure practice and mental practice of disposal? And I'm going to get to this Karl Marx quote in a second, but much more recently, this prudishness about poop came from Victorian England, where a lot of other colonial policies and Christian hegemonic cultural impositions developed. And that went all over the world, trampling local customs and integrative practices in the area of excreta that would have been there and done by indigenous peoples there. And so The European upper class worldview interpreted Christianity as not highly valuing the body, rather equating this oozing, stinking, shedding, laughing, loving bag that we live in as like worldly and sinful to regard, right? So ideas of separation and purity and whiteness and sanitation were upheld as holy. So the technological innovations of that time treated excreta, both urine and feces, as threatening and dangerous, and to be separated from as far as possible from the producer, as any producer of this excreta could afford, right? So the more that one did not have to speak of such topics, the more civilized one was considered. So the technical system that came out of this worldview, values, stories, which is a lot of what we study in the study of religion, it was the freshwater flush pedestal toilet. So it was an incredibly effective system, as the collection device did an excellent job of separating defecators from the contents of their bowels. And it heralded like a new area of health for its users in like the mid 1800s, right? There was a battle at this time, though, between water closets and earth closets. It wasn't even necessarily divided. Even during that sanitation revolution, it wasn't decided which direction it would go. Water closet detractors argued that the people who were pro earth closets and didn't like water closets said that the practice of putting our excreta in fresh water furthered what we now call the metabolic rift. And this rift meant that nutrient cycling, excreta returning to the land as fertilizer, ended. And Foster coined that term, building on Marx, who wrote about it in volume capital 3, and that's what the quote is here. Marx says, excretions of consumption are of the greatest importance for agriculture. So far as their utilization is concerned, there is an enormous waste of them in the capitalist economy. In London, for instance, they can find no better use for the excretion of 4.5 million human beings than to contaminate the Thames with it at heavy expense. Right? Karl Marx, patron saint of Rich Earth Institute. Anyway. But, a lot of stuff gets picked up by folks who work on Marx, but not as much this. What an oversight. Right? In all of the discussions. So why this taboo? So though germ theory was still unknown to the English at the time of some of the huge pandemics they have to be near the smell or handle the contents of a chamber pot violated the distinctive categories between the clean upper class and the dirty underclass. To even have to discuss it became an embarrassment, let alone research it. But here we go. Right? So again, the lack of a neutral word stifles conversation about the reality of bodily elimination and the material excreta. So it's difficult to address sanitation as a matter of public concern or an ethical issue. And that in turn reduces the ability for new ideas to be shared at every level of society where innovation could be happening to address this global sanitation crisis. The lack of dignified sanitation options is causing pathogen spread and disease on one hand, and on the other hand, in the flushed and plumbed world, as Rhodes George was saying, it causes toxification and eutrophication of waterways. Black and Fawcett say that conversations about sanitation are avoided because of these social taboos about the body and bodily waste in particular. But waste is one of the words that I won't use, however, because in natural cycles, there is no waste. And a waste isn't a waste until you waste it. Right? High recommendation for Lisa Bjerke's question, is it a waste to call it waste? And the way that the term waste abstracts us from the resources, or to lean in even further, the relatives, right? In Haudenosaunee space and understanding, as well as Anishinaabe and many other indigenous groups on Turtle Island, everyone is a relative, and there's a pushback on the thingification of life. And so people think about water as relative, not as water resources. So it's interesting to think about poop as relative. What kind of relative would poop be? Well, in some ways, poop it's you, but it's the old you. So it's kind of like a relative across time. It's also our relative in terms of the fact that it's got a lot of dead material in it, but it's teeming with life, like a lot of bacteria. And so thinking about how poop is our relative could be a fun thing that we can nerd out on later today or tomorrow. And I have this book, Everyone Poops, but I also want to give a shout out and gratitude for Kim's book, All People Pee. These are staples in our household right now. Really, really great as we are potty training, right? And trying to do it in a sense of not using shame and being very present to this very deep rite of passage within our society around potty training. And more we can talk about there in question and answer. But by learning to call what comes out of our bodies what they are as like discarded resources, because we can embrace discard. All beings discard, with the exception maybe of an eyelash mite that apparently has a full closed loop circle. But other than that, all beings discard. We can embrace that we discard. But once we embrace that, we ask, where and how is my discard being used and understood? And also, how are systems discarding? Who's discarded? This is the direction that this presentation is going to go, to ask these questions about how our systems frame how we understand discard. And so there is a whole field. It's called discard studies. And a number of us scholars of crap, which sounds better than crappy scholars. That's where we do our work. In discard studies, a lot of us. And examining how and what systems discard in order to reproduce themselves. Right, so, all right, well, little teaser there. Okay, so my work actually is integrated at the areas of environmental studies and religion, because I noticed that tackling the climate crisis wasn't a matter of just sharing facts and figures with folks, but it was a matter of looking at worldviews, values, and experiences, and how we make meaning and what is our ultimate orientation that often makes space for different ways of materializing commitments. But how did I get involved with this? Now here we go. I mean, long story short, I ran away with the circus. That's like, because it's so interesting. Like, how did all of us get in the room and in the Zoom room, right? Our life paths being drawn to this. How odd. So I'm looking forward to sharing stories and learning your story. Mine is that I went with the circus. It wasn't just any circus. It was a grassroots carnival de resistance. This eco-theological environmental justice carnival was exploring how the cry of the earth and the cry of humanity are one. We tried to practice what we preached, which was an invitation to rewilding, reorientation, reintegration. So we lived in tents during a month-long residency at a place where we were invited to perform these biblically based elemental plays. And we also had a fossil fuel-free kitchen. We biked everywhere, and we had composting toilets. At first, when I met this composting toilet, I was like, ew. No. I was disgusted. I could do everything else, but I kind of like just drew the line there. But, look, when you gotta go, you gotta go. So I went and sat down, excreted, took a scoop of the flush material, some sawdust, put it on top, covered it. Okay, I didn't die. Wow. Okay, so I did that like a couple of weeks. But it was when, at the end of the carnival, we biked with a bike trailer full of a bunch of shit buckets. We took it over to Richard. I said Richard. We should have taken it to Vermont, but there's a group in Virginia that works on this, and they're called the New Community Project, and they showed us how they were reintegrating the human manure into orchards, flower beds, biochar, fuel. Whoa, I was so moved. And I was like, okay, new life goal. What will it take for me to not have to poop and pee in fresh water again? Let's do this, right? And so I started on that, and I immediately began to see how intertwined the freshwater flush system was with all the other apparatus of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. So I was like, okay, this is about to be revolution from the bottom up. Let's go. And I need to study what's going on. So that's kind of what propelled me into doing this study. Who's talking about this? Where are they? What's going well? What's challenging? Right. So here we are at the nearly end of 5 years of study and the 10th Rich Earth Institute Summit. And I have not run out of material. We haven't run out of material. So this is what happened. It's worthy of study, serious study. So as I mentioned, it's interdisciplinary. And the reason for that is we have information from scientists that say, like, I used to think the top global problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change, the top environmental problems. And I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Right? Gus Beth was at Yale Forest and Environmental Studies School, right? And so I began to think about these connections. And not going into this now, but just what I looked at and what I think could be important to this crew would be to know that religious institutions and adherents are ubiquitous around the world. And, religious institutions are not diminishing in number, they're growing. And so as sites which are on the front lines often of climate chaos and disaster response, we've seen this very much with Hurricanes Helene and Milton, as well as Katrina, and just every disaster response. Religious institutions of various types are places people go to have their basic needs met. And if there's a potential for partnership between what you're working on with ecological sanitation, there could be something there, a place to maybe put a wasted porta potty, or, a place where people could experience a different way of excreting in a context they know is not their home, but one in which they generally feel safe and they're open to new ideas based on the community. But so I look at how spaces, organizations that religious groups have, built-in audiences, volunteer time, money, and affinity groups, how all of this could actually be used to spread ecological sanitation. Yeah. But I haven't spoke very directly to this. Julia did speak about the sanitation crisis in your intro around why many of us are motivated and where we can intersect with those who are doing the nutrient reclamation. But the number of people living in urban areas without access to improved sanitation is increasing because of the rapid growth of many urban areas in the last 30 years, which has to do with neoliberal economic policy and extending the metabolic rift. But no, the dual sanitation crisis, this is some shit that will piss you off. It is so intense. 3.5 billion people and climbing with no toilet, no bucket, no pit latrine, no porta potty, no box, and left untreated and segregated from the soil. Excreta nearly always breeds diseases. And this is particularly poop being pathogenic. Urine is basically sterile, as you all know. But when they're mixed together, there's, bacteria swim, they don't crawl. There's just all sorts of things that start to happen. But 2,000 children dying of diarrhea every day. And diarrhea and the subsequent dehydration are the second biggest killer of children worldwide under 5 years old. And we really want to paint a picture that more than HIV, malaria, measles combined, and it's like the casualties of levels of violent conflict. And so just why we would compare the sanitation crisis to violent conflict is because we need to paint a picture of devastation that is caused by the lack of dignified sanitation. And there's a deep silence about it. So in talking about this, as advocates, I'm sure you all have maybe faced people saying, well, I would love to work on that, but I'm pretty overwhelmed with what I'm working on elsewhere. I say, and I don't really know how to entertain ecological sanitation. Just I've been moved, and I hope that the framework of excretory justice can assist us in being able to say, hey, we're not asking you to sideline any of the important work that you're doing. We just want to add a dimension of depth and connection that doesn't forget, that doesn't flush and forget, that doesn't push things out of sight, out of mind, right? And of course, the GDP cost and the environmental cost as a result of combined sewer overflows and the rising cost of water are an issue in many places as well. And so this dual sanitation crisis is both upon us and continuing. And I do think that a lot of people will switch to various forms of ecological sanitation in a panic, but it is good to be gathered with you all who are shifting before there's a panic. And this really is life-saving work for people on the planet that you're doing. So thank you. Some terms that I use in my dissertation and that you already know, ecological sanitation there, and we'll speak a little bit more. I began to talk about defecatory justice in 2017, and they give out, these are frameworks for not only having a justice advocacy for the humans involved in trying to find dignified sanitation that meets their human rights to sanitation, but also some kind of framework that would love on the material itself. Are there justice frameworks that care for both the human and the material? So this is building on environmental justice and getting specific, and then excretory justice, which covers like excreta more broadly. I have not coined urinary justice. It very much sounds like something in the doctor's office. So maybe we can work on that. Pee justice, pissed off for justice. Anyway, it's all a work in progress. Point being, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that framework in a second. The third one, and why I want to share it with you all, is because I feel that this is a community that can help give me feedback on my work or critique it. But when I'm doing interviews with people, if I use the word toilet, the image, coming from that French toilet, you got that water closet, like, is a freshwater flush pedestal toilet. So if I ask someone, what toilet system are you interested in? That framework of that entity, right? And a lot of the world squats and a lot of the world water washes. And so, the image of the porcelain god with a teepee on the side, I'm looking for a way to talk about that, plus the system of sewers and pipes, or on the ecological side, and the devices that collect, transport, process, and then dispose or reintegrate excreta. So I came up with the term excreta infrastructure system, or EXIS. Just trying to think about how different language might be able to help people theoretically, not immediately think of one socio-enviro-technical system, but kind of lean in and say, okay, what is an excreta infrastructure system? And to know that it's not only the collection device, but it's this whole system, this process of digesting where the individual meets the communal, right? Because as soon as we jiggle that handle or push that button or empty that bucket, it becomes something that the community needs to digest. So it's a very interesting intersection. I'm also interested in the vocab you've come up with. So very specifically to the vocab, excretory justice as a framework that operates alongside other visions of justice in the service of collective liberation, planetary regeneration, and the adoption of pro-environmental behaviors. As a practical concern, it seeks to ensure that what comes out of our bodies remains within the natural cycle of decomposition. Right? Decay, composting, and death are all part of the cycles of life, but premature vulnerability, genocide, ecocide, all of those are, and carceral logics, those are not natural cycles of decomposition, right? So what does it mean to allow people and what comes out of our bodies to have and experience justice throughout their life cycle, which includes death, decay, composting. Yeah. So you can like look at a situation or take a situation maybe and say, okay, is there excretory justice in this situation? Theoretically, the lens could examine other issues or other species feces and excreta as well. The reason I started with defecatory justice is because there's a particularity to defecation that's different than urinating or menstruating. And so that framework still has utility, but the broader frame of excretory justice or excretory injustice can encompass the material and production of a range of discarded body material. So, so often when I'm speaking with folks who are not as experienced in pee cycling, this is, when I do share with them around how poop and pee are quite different substances, right? And could require distinct handling in terms of how they might cycle through in a circular economy or how they might flow into the cycle. So these are important. Also, just heads up, there is the term menstrual justice did get emerged. Margaret Johnson emerged that in 2019, and her framework is coming from Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw's framework of intersectionality onto menstruation. And so, yeah, just if you have raw material data that you want scholars to look at and think about as case studies, we're super open to that. We really want to feature the work that is happening and assist you in supporting reflecting and debriefing some of the things you're seeing out there on the front lines, right? Because all these embodied dimensions of gender and sexuality and race, I mean, they've historically been contested at the site of the bathroom and continue to be contested. And what are the ways in which potentially bodies, instead of being domesticating the body's interior for biopolitical ends that serve the state, how might kind of this collective liberation, which decenters the state and thinks about other ways of how we can be together, how can these frameworks be supportive to you? Yeah. And it's because of the way that ecological sanitation excretory infrastructure systems can fulfill excretory justice. That's why I choose to center it along with other sanitation solutions in my research. And I think it has the potential for contributing to the creation of a climate resilient, post-capitalist, socio-environmental system of systems, right? And there's no one size fits all solution, but the sense of self-governance and maintenance of systems at particular levels. I want to give a shout out to the piece that Jamina and Haley and others worked on and just published about students. And when students, high school students, are given the opportunity to think through their values and what they want to see in the world and excreta infrastructure systems, they don't necessarily just choose the freshwater flush pedestal toilet, but like there is the potential of, wow, my daily action could reinforce the world I want to see versus consistently taking me away from it, not by choice, but by complicity because other systems aren't permitted and allowed. And so this is the part that in the, oh, there we go. Okay. This is the part that's in the dissertation. Y'all recognize a lot of these faces, but I talk about the barriers to ecological sanitation because if it works so well, why doesn't everybody do it? So there are numerous barriers that I name, and these are three of them, and talk about that more if you'd like. Yeah. And I'll just leave this here, just thinking about challenges and benefits as I determine how I want to wrap up today. So you're welcome to read that for the moment. And I'll just say I did go to the Reinvent a Toilet like challenge museum opening just to see what the foundation was up to, and I think that while it's been phenomenal to have a group with such a high profile focused on the issues of the dual sanitation crisis, right? Like shipping the, I mean, the brand is called American Standard, right? I mean, like shipping the American Standard toilet everywhere or trying to reinvent it in a high tech way won't necessarily cover everywhere that we need to, but like having these range of options, I think is really key. And the Gates Foundation helped to do that, and so many more people are now able to think with and think against and think around some of these things. So wanted to thank them for the materials that they've put together. Y'all know how ecological sanitation works. Shout out to Soil Haiti, where I also had a chance to visit very early on in my work. And when I give this presentation often, I like show examples of what's happening around the world. I've learned a lot from people in Kenya working at scale on these things. And then some people are like, yeah, okay, that's outside the country though. What about inside the country? So I went to visit Joe Jenkins, the Humanure Handbook author himself, and he showed me his tripartite system and how it functions. And that was an amazing experience. And it showed me there's his gardens in the back, right? So like things are blooming. It's pretty amazing. And at the same time, though, people are like, great, well, that's rural, but what about urban? Right? So I got to go visit Pat Lando and just I learned a long time ago about the great work of Molly and others at Recode. And so here we are in the living building in downtown Portland. And so like having a chance to visit so many crews has been really meaningful. And then this is a part of the presentation where I definitely shout out Rich Earth Institute and the work that's happening at scale with regards to this. And I'm hoping this summer to go visit the folks at La Bistoquette and their work in the production of the urine-based product here, as well as their full system. And you know, it's so great because like the humor is continental in the sense that they have a self-governance group that wants to work at creating a sanitation commission. And, you know, in French, the word for big is gros. So they call themselves the Gross Commission, which I think is fabulous. But they're gonna produce knowledge, I think, for our community around what it means to govern and maintain a system so large. So finally, and I will go about 5 minutes over. Finally, I want to just like share about how I'm bringing in critical environmental justice, which is a framework that both builds on and critiques environmental justice movement work, and these times of struggle and this level of environmental justice invites us not only to have like a state-centered advocacy stream, but one that is not state-centered nor takes the state as a given or granted. So this really centers the way a lot of indigenous environmental studies is done. It's also multi-scalar, so really giving appreciation for many scales, not only very large or very small, for where wins can be gotten. And I think that EcoSan permitting group is a really wonderful expression of this, working both at municipal scale while also connecting nationally, while supporting people who are doing small levels of experiences. And so just to say like this work that you're all doing, everyone like in many ways is aiding the environmental justice movement. And we're like, I encourage everyone to continue to work intersectionally, right? Who are we working with? Whose voices are we missing? How might we pay attention to that which is invisibilized? All this can enhance our work together. And most of all, critical environmental justice invites us to challenge expendability. And this is a place where I think that because we are not treating our excreta like shit, we challenge expendability. Challenging expendability is about countering the ideology of white supremacy and human dominism. It's about articulating perspectives that the excluded, the marginalized, and othered populations, beings, and things must not be viewed as expendable, but rather as indispensable to our collective future. So, moving towards a politics of indispensability and contesting the politics of expendability is what I want to invite us to do in each of our work. Right? So, if the worldview is that the earth is a supply house and a landfill, not a living entity in which we live, move, and have our being, then we can continue flushing and forgetting and treating our shit and people like shit. But if we have a politics of indispensability, the reclamation and connection of what is the maybe weirdest, grossest, or most culturally despised part of us can help us reconnect to the whole of life. It can also, I think, perhaps increase our tolerance for conflict, tension, and willingness to be with the stuff we don't like. In a politics of indispensability, we don't have the option to simply push away people or be violent to them, dumping them into locations that are out of sight or out of mind. In my dissertation, I focus on welcoming climate refugees, embracing disability justice, and the impacts of carceral logics on current policies related to refugees, differently abled folks, and excreta. Right? So let's develop systems of dealing with the difficulty, like we deal with the pathogens in our excreta, or the pharmaceuticals that everyone always seems to be very concerned about, right? What does safety composition look like, right? We can provide answers for this as more experiments continue, as we continue to lean in, breaking the taboo and say, this is a part of what it means to be alive together. So a current example of expendability is the Missouri State execution of Marcellus Khalifa Williams. Just a few weeks ago, months ago, I guess now, like exonerated by DNA, but regardless of that, those who had the power to continue the execution made a calculation that continuing on the path of killing him publicly, despite many, many people opposing it, including the prosecution, that continuing on the path of killing would be less disruptive to their lives than allowing him to live. So alternatives to incarceration and the death penalty, they don't mean not doing anything to address harm whenever it occurs. It includes initiatives such as circles of accountability and support that have as their goal reintegration. Also, to bring it home, like back to Onondaga, like wastewater treatment plants are much more likely to be sited in communities of color than white communities. They smell, there's stigma, they often displace families, and the water bodies in those areas are significantly detrimentally impacted. It's a common environmental justice violation. And this was slated to happen in Syracuse, but from 2000 onward, a decade of struggle, Black and Indigenous communities coming together. They filed a Title VI civil rights violation with the EPA. They didn't hear back on that, though I will say the folks in Lowndes County did hear back, and there's some amazing innovations happening there now with Lixil and others, and that conversation, right? To refuse this expendability, to refuse to push it out of sight and out of mind. These are some, I can go back to those practical, but in general, for you on Zoom and in the chat, or maybe folks in your notebook as we wrap up, if you have other examples of the politics of expendability that are happening, feel free to jot those down. And in contrast, what would the politics of indispensability bring? That is a question that I'm going to be chasing. I often invite some practical applications from listeners that are in a broad audience, and I'm also sharing this with you because if this presentation can be supportive to you and your group, like I'm happy to team up with you and we co-present and we change this presentation some, we bring in your stuff, and then we like work together, just like getting the word out in different venues. So I generally end with these, which is like invitation to call excreta as specifically as possible, avoiding the word waste if you're willing, and say thank you every time you flush the toilet, if you are using a freshwater flush toilet, and like shout a huge hurrah if you're able to use, you know, something that is functioning as a part of an eco-sand exis. But the invitation to transform a habitual moment into an intentional one is the invitation. And if you're up for it, add defecatory justice or excretory justice, really, to the list of issues that you name when you're speaking about or advocating for climate justice. I will end with this poem, and I look forward to talking with you all like later today and tomorrow to like answer questions and question answers. But since I'll end with a poem, I do want to just like give a quick shout out to Sean Schaffner, who, just by calling poop like an acronym, the people's own organic power, just invites us to think about what we will do with our power. And there are ways that you can stay in connection with me that I'll drop in the chat later. And also, if you want to connect with soil, I aim to not be an extractive researcher, and so I donate $1 to soil for everyone every time I do this presentation, just because of what's happening in that revolutionary country of Haiti these days, as well as the xenophobia here in the States. So I will close with this poem. Staying with the trouble requires making odd kin. That is, we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations, in hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all. Alone in our separate kinds of expertise and experience, we know both too much and too little, and we succumb to despair or hope, and neither is a sensible attitude. So I'm excited to hear from you all as the day goes on. I think we can just be in this flow in the Zoom room and others. And thank you so much to those who are in person there and sharing. And I'm interested in your gut reactions, and we will stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Seeing the applause from the room. So we have about a little less than 10 minutes for questions. Is there anything that's on deck? Yes, in fact. So Sarah, the first question is coming from Carol McCreary. Thank you. There's so many devices. Isn't our EcoSan permitting work ultimately state-centered? And doesn't it recognize the need to replace current state-mandated path-dependent sanitation systems and map out a new regulatory environment? What's your thoughts on that?
So I think in many ways, the state is very big and very powerful within what we're working on. And so it is, I think, fine to, in some ways, we enhance the state when we work with it. And if it is able to make shifts, right, it becomes a stronger state. And just knowing that it's not the only way to be in governance together, I think it's important, like as I study religious groupings, right? Like there are other religious ways of understanding the state, but I often like to say something like this. Crucially, there's no substitute for collectively developing systems of self-governance that transcend the value sets, worldviews, and experiences of any one particular group. And so I think that there's a way in which the state could be that, but I'll just show you my sweatshirt because this is what I really think. And so, like, can we have state mechanisms that are not bolstered by a type of militarism and coercive violence that maintain people's allegiance, but by life-giving systems? And I would also say the other piece that's been really liberatory is watching Indigenous folks think about sovereignty, excretory sovereignty, which is the first time I've ever said that. But as in some desires to not rely on the state, are recognizing that even in these, even in the excretory infrastructure system, they need to be thinking about what self-reliance looks like. And the other, I think the other interesting challenge to the state would be like many people who are into not having big government and stuff are fine for the government to handle their poop for them and handle all that stuff for them. And I would say Joe Jenkins is a notable exception in this. And is libertarian all the way down in many ways, and has nothing to do with the state. So I I just tell people, if you think politics is a shit show now, wait till they're actually discussing our sewering systems and like people like the backing up into people's houses, or the impacts of septic, right? So I think that is how I will answer that question now. Very clear question, very convoluted answer, but we'll continue to make the way together as we go.
Yeah, these are complicated issues. One more, maybe we have time for like three more. How can you give us a definition of expendability? This question is coming from Marine Legrand, and Julia offered this definition in the chat that expendability means something is capable of being expended or used up or is more easily replaced than protected. Maybe you want to expand upon that. And I do think, I know for myself too, this tension almost or complementariness of expendability or indispensability, and also the discard is normal, right? So there is a lot of nuance there. Can you poke at that a little?
Sure. I'll think about it from the perspective of direction. If and the story of stuff is really helpful here too, right? If things are just extracted, then produced, then distributed, then consumed, then disposed of, that's an expendability trajectory. I think we might maybe just think about expendability as something that's linear, and other forms of is and something else in expendability has some aspect of cyclical or spiraling or regenerative with it. And so the question of who or what is being discarded can often give us clues around whether something is happening healthfully, and is not expendable, but often where if there's a sense that whatever you're throwing away or flushing away is going away, the challenge is to say there is no away land. Like everywhere is somewhere. So if we're thinking about those somewheres, even if we're acting to some extent in a similar fashion, there's something that's changing within us around orientation to understand that there's a consciousness about those who are upstream or downstream of us, right? Sometimes we look at putting the golden rule in water systems, right? Do unto those downstream as you'd have those upstream do to you. And so a bit of that reorientation. Thank you. I'll look
Yeah.
in.
Oh, thank you. I know we've been taking from the chat. Are there any from the live people who have words out of their mouths? Other questions that want to be asked out here? Yeah, go for it. Or I'll repeat. I'll go back.
Yeah, you can ask it from there.
Looking forward to meeting your.
She wants to meet you. I'm just repeating one chunk at a time.
Comment on a little bit more about, I know that maybe we'll use the word spirituality, but your experience with religion and Canadian studies and how that relates to like the nutrients that are in our bodies and what we're eating, returning that to the natural cycle. You touched on it a bit.
Yeah, so you touched on some of the religious framework and the storytelling around a kind of around that framework and being in touch with those communities. I think this will probably be our last question. Could you talk a little bit more about either what that experience has been like, how religious communities sort of receive this information? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yeah, let's start there, and there will be more to discuss.
Sounds great. Well, one thing that is pretty awesome is that religions are quite what I define religion as like long social movements with existential claims that people make different choices about, and they make different choices as they go, right? And so these are long and durable social movements. And so reminding folks of some of the the ways that things were done at other times is helpful, right? So bringing forth, for example, in Judaism, the prayer upon leaving the bathroom or using the bathroom, the Asher Yatzar, or like in Buddhism, how pooping and peeing has to do with like the origins of humanity and how we understand attachment or non-attachment. Or in Hinduism, there's some really clear and practical instructions about like the delineations around meditation and the meditation of excretion and how to, like in Islam, how to clean oneself before, prayers, and that's in a communal space. So there's all these smart kind of hygienic pieces. I mean, in Christianity too, it's very interesting. There's a debate around whether or not Jesus pooped, right? And so there's all sorts of inroads actually to say, hey, religious folks have been talking about this for a while because, our bodies, depending on different conceptualizations, right? They're conceptualized as temples, or they're conceptualized as creation, or they're conceptualized as instruments. And so all of that has been, so far, I've had a warm reception. And I was like super nervous when I went into school, right? Like, because people would be telling, we'd be at parties and people like, oh, what do you work on? What do you work on? What do you work on? And I was like, I'm going to be the one that's like, I work on Excreta. But it surprised me. Every time I've said, oh, yeah, I'm working on the toilet, both the ritual and the receptacle. People are like, oh, do I have a story for you? Like, so I would say that many religious communities, and religious people and others have just, it's just like they've been waiting for someone to bring it up. And so
Mm.
it's been going well. But I think that overall, religious institutions and spaces, when there are those who can bring expertise and support what a religious leader is doing or what they need in terms of providing for communities around them, with that expertise, support, and if you like have a grant or financial things, so far it's been, people are interested in at least thinking about it.
Yeah, so there is an opportunity to kind of ground this work in traditional practice, in, I want to say, like the religious myth also, of what do we believe, where do we come from, and or ritual practices. I know I would say from my experience though, and their support is needed, to ask us, someone who's used to standing up with a Bible on a pulpit to a lot of people to talk about poop, pee, and toilets, even though it's in the Bible, is still pretty tricky. It can be. So there's definitely need for folks like you, like us, to help to bridge those gaps. We are going to now take a pause. Let's give one more giant round of applause to Sarah. Thank you.